Greetings, and thank you for joining us on Get the Tea with Buta. I'm your host, Buta Biberaj. Our producer today is Nick Gothard, as usual. We're honored to have a very special guest. And before I introduce her by name, I wanted to introduce you to her by topic. As you know, I am the Commonwealth's attorney for Loudoun County. And as that responsibility is part of, we do a lot of trainings and we do a lot of sharing of information so we can stay on top of what the law is and what the situations are within our community. I ended up attending a CLE, which is a continuing legal education program where Dr. Orloff was presenting. And the topic she presented on was very timely. And it was timely because prior to maybe within the last 6 months, I had not heard of any recent incidents where we had the Department of Homeland Security coming into our courthouse and removing individuals from within the courthouse based on immigration status. This has since happened twice. And I just thought that that was a very interesting and also alarming occurrence. So I tracked down Dr. Orloff, and she very graciously has agreed to talk to us about the issues of immigration and how it also works with the legal justice system. Really also from a point of the victim's perspective and the impact it has on our victim population. So I would like to introduce you to Dr. Lesyle Orloff. Dr. Orloff, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. If I may get you to introduce yourself, and as I indicated what the topic is for us here today, your background is just out of control, amazing. So please start where you would like to, share the information you want us to know, and then also throughout our conversation, we will also touch on some of the other areas of your experience and expertise.
Sure. So I'm Lesyle Orloff. I'm an adjunct professor at American University, Washington College of Law, and I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at the law school. I've been working for over 30 years with immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, stalking, human trafficking, and had the great privilege of being in the right place in the right time in the early 90s. So I was the lead, I guess you could say, lobbyist working with on the Violence Against Women Act with then Senator Biden, and kind of co-directed something called the National Network to End Violence Against Immigrant Women, which was a coalition of organizations, victim rights organizations, women's rights, domestic violence, and immigrant rights groups that were trying to collaborate and work together to craft remedies that would allow immigrant crime victims to get the protections they needed to be able to come forward, seek protection orders, win custody of children, and cooperate in criminal investigations and prosecutions. And so I worked on drafting the VAWA self-petition, the Violence Against Women Act self-petition, the U visa, which is a crime victim visa, and the T visa, which is for human trafficking victims. And so in the program I run now, we provide nationally training and technical assistance to support those in the field and in communities that are working. The way I think about it is to make these laws come off of a piece of paper and come alive in the lives of the victims and the survivors and the law enforcement and prosecutors that they were designed to help.
Okay. Excellent. So I want to talk a little bit about how over the years, the focus and impact has changed. Because you said that these laws started back in the 1990s, or at least you became very active within that time. Did you see once we got into the mid-20 teens that the focus changed from it being in furtherance and in support of our immigration victim population as to where now it became something that was a tool used against them?
Oh, for sure. I mean, what's interesting, though, the way I think about it, because I was the first Spanish-speaking attorney who knew what a protection order was in D.C. in 1983. So back then, this is before the Violence Against Women Act. So I was focusing on family court remedies for immigrant survivors. And the reason I go back that far is what I've seen over the course of my career is that I really used to believe that the perpetrators have changed in their tactics and that they're using immigration status more now than they were before. But what I think is really happening is that they were always doing it. But back then, there was not very much money in immigration enforcement. So they'd call up a phone number to call, and there was nobody there to pick up the phone. And as the federal government began to invest more and more money in immigration enforcement, there were more people by those phones. And so I think that's part of it. I do think that as in times, this happened in the 90s, like there was a big anti-immigrant push in the mid 90s. And now again in the 2000 teens and whatever, that as in times when anti-immigrant sentiment goes up in the US, perpetrators become more emboldened and empowered. And so they become more likely, more effective in using immigration-related status and threats to turn a victim in, if they call the police for help, if they work with a prosecutor's office, or if they seek a protection order or even go to a shelter. And so I think it's a combination of the times and how perpetrators try to use it. So for example, we did a piece of research in 2000. I do legal work and research, but I also do some social science research. And so we did some social science research to compare what was happening in 2016 versus 2017. And what we found was that these things we were talking about, these VAWA self-petitions, and I don't like talking in numbers and letters. So that's basically US citizen. These are help for victims of domestic violence and child abuse, whose abusers are their US citizen husbands and fathers. Easiest way to think of it. Those are the biggest groups. And that group that absolutely has immigration status, nothing has changed. There was a 391% drop in the willingness of victims to seek self-petitions between 2006, from 2016 and 2017.
I'm sorry, what was that percentage again?
391. And it was, these are spouses of US citizens and lawful permanent residents who were abused, who were terrified, because those citizens and lawful permanent residents were able to use the immigration-related abuse and control became a more potent threat in anti-immigrant times and times when immigration enforcement were going up.
I remember prior to becoming the chief prosecutor for Loudoun County, I used to do criminal defense, but my law partners would do also domestic law. And I remember the conversations within our legal community being where people would anecdotally tell the stories where the opposing side would do that to the spouse and say, either one, give me all my demands, give me full custody of the kids, do not ask for child support, do not ask for spousal, or else. And the or else was somehow or another, I'm going to withdraw my sponsorship of your legal status and you're going to be deported. And it was effective as heck, because at that point, people don't understand whether it will work or it won't work. And anytime you could threaten somebody to take away their kids, it's a very powerful way to do it. Anytime you could threaten somebody that you're going to take away their community and their society, that's very powerful. So those were huge threats and very impactful in the power play between spouses. So you saw that in civil practice.
Right, exactly.
Yep. So yeah, unfortunate. What I want to do is I do want to focus on the criminal law arena. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier the phrase a U visa, and you said it's a victim's visa. Briefly tell us, what does that actually mean?
Okay. So this was created in 2000 as part of the Violence Against Women Act and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it was created because Congress recognized that there were crime victims of domestic violence, sexual assaults, stalking, human trafficking, felonious assault, all kinds of criminal activities that are very violent and almost always recidivist, meaning they happen over and over again. And that if you look at that and you recognize that even back then, 20 some odd percent, now I think it's 24.5% of the US population are either foreign born or have one or more foreign born parents. So there's this whole chunk of the communities that we live in, where people can't come forward and seek help and report crimes. And if they can't report crimes, then you can't stop the serial rapist in the community. You can't stop the domestic violence perpetrator or the child abuser who may leave one victim and go on and abuse another. You can't fight gangs. There have been domestic violence victims who have saved the lives of police officers. There have been domestic violence victims who've gotten help, who've turned in information that led to the uncovering of a terrorist cell. I mean, if these people can come forward and report crimes, then it's safer for all of us. And so what Congress did is create a special visa for crime victims who found the courage or mustered the courage to come forward and make a police report or work with the prosecutor. And so they have to be helpful. They have to have made a police report, or they have to have worked with a prosecutor, or they have to have gotten a protection order. They have to have revealed to the child welfare agency that their kid is being abused. I mean, something like that. And then it creates a crime victim visa where if they've been abused and they can show they've suffered criminal activity and they can show that they've suffered substantial harm because of that criminal activity, and that they've been helpful to law enforcement or prosecutors or the EEOC or the state courts, they can get protection from deportation in the United States. It is a long process. So it's not something that somebody with a criminal history can easily wind their way through, because there are background checks every 2, 3, 4 years as they're waiting what's like a 20 some odd year process right now.
Wow.
But the great news is that we just finished some social science research that shows that the real benefits of these programs start happening when the victims get protection from deportation and work authorization, which can come much sooner. Right now, it takes 5 years, but the government has just implemented some policies that should bring that down to under a year, which is really going to help more victims come forward.
And I like that perspective, because as I mentioned in our opening, one of my attorneys had come back to our office and had reported, and it was a domestic violence case. The accused was the dad. The witnesses were the mom, the victim, and the child, who's also a peripheral victim, but he was the witness to that as well. And they come into court. There's a resolution made, which is consistent with the first-time offenders, that's offered pretty much to just about any first-time offender that does not commit a serious injury or things of that nature. They went into the courtroom to enter the resolution, and the child is in the courtroom, the mom is in the courtroom, and the accused husband is in the courtroom. As they're finalizing the resolution, and everybody has told this little kid that everybody's going home, then DHS comes in and they end up taking dad into custody, into handcuffs in front of the kid. And the attorney came back to my office and she was devastated. She was devastated because she saw the trauma that the kid was experiencing. Mm-hmm. So we start looking about these actions that put DHS in the courtrooms. I think we have to look at what is the ripple effect and then the trauma that is causing in the remaining layers, because I think to a certain degree, they could have got him outside. It would have been something that they were well within their right, because he had violated the reentry laws. So I'm not suggesting they were unlawful in their actions, but time and place for everything.
Oh, yeah.
Because now for this kid, for the mom, and anybody else who they come into contact with, the courtrooms are not safe. The courtrooms are not safe because we can't trust that we go in and that we come out. Mm-hmm. And that was just really just a harsh lesson for my attorney to have gone through, but more importantly for that young child.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, really what we're trying to do as a system and a society is to decrease the trauma that a kid experiences, because we can't undo that. Right. And I was wondering if you could speak to, because I think they came out with changes within the last maybe season or so, that DHS has been instructed to stay away from, or maybe I'll call them safe harbors, areas that they cannot go into to be able to enforce the immigration laws.
Exactly. So there are what they call sensitive locations. There are certain locations that are kind of off limits for immigration enforcement. that have been for a while that did not include courthouses until February of this year. And I'll explain, they didn't include criminal courtrooms until February of this year. Prior to that, but some of the other safe locations, so that your listeners know, are things like faith-based institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, schools, healthcare providers, healthcare centers, places like that. They've been barring immigration enforcement for over a decade. Both Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are barred from those locations, absent, hot pursuit of a terrorist or something like that.
Right.
Now, in January 2018, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement issued a policy that said they would stop immigration enforcement in family courts and in civil courts, and that they would agree to only go after a particular targeted individual at a courthouse, not the people that went with them, not the witnesses, et cetera. So that was an initial change that happened in January of 2018. But the problem with that policy is exactly the example you gave, that they didn't touch criminal courtrooms. And so in February of this year, they rescinded the prior policy and required something that they used to do for only family courts, which was, if you want to go do an enforcement action in a family court and you're an Immigration and Customs Enforcement, an ICE official, you have to get permission, written permission from the big boss, the head of your division, that has to personally sign off on it. And but that wasn't happening with criminal courtrooms. Now the new policy says no enforcement at or near courtrooms, and it defines finally for the first time that the parking lots are included, that, let's say you have a courthouse, but people who participate in a batterers treatment program run by the courthouse, that's in a building across the street, but it's court ordered, that's covered. So it's court-related facilities. So the at or near definition is much better than it's ever been. And it includes criminal cases as well. And that it's not to say that that won't happen, but even the old policy, the idea of an immigration enforcement officer walking into a courtroom of any kind and arresting somebody while in open court was supposed to have stopped in 2018, but it obviously did not and hasn't. And that this policy of requiring every immigration ICE official or CBP official to go to their boss's boss, essentially, all the way up to the top of the chain in their office.
Right.
Like it's like you being the prosecutor, right? So they have to go the head of their field office to get individual permission for an individual person with an individual decision that this is the only way they can do it. There'll be some exceptions, but then they're supposed to call and coordinate with the court staff so that they can have, there are places in a courthouse in lockup, for example, or places that are not in public view where they could go and execute an enforcement action about an individual once the court has completed its work regarding that individual. And that's how it's supposed to be. I mean, it's a change that's brand new. I'm sure that, it's something people should know about, particularly prosecutors, so that they can call the field office director and say, what are you doing in the courtroom? Why? Because it's a violation and that shouldn't be happening anymore.
And I appreciate that information because, as you indicated earlier, it really is all about the community safety. We want our community members to feel safe in calling law enforcement. Right. Be it a crime that they are reporting that is against them or someone else in the community. And I know you and I previously spoke a bit about some facts that you have learned and have been told directly as to when a victim I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say victim, an immigrant has come forward, and although they may not have been documented, they put their liberty at risk to be able to come forward with information that did save lives.
Right.
And I'll just give you, by way of a story of a case that we have, pending in our jurisdiction right now, where the wrongdoer when he was speaking to the victims, women that he would take advantage of, some of the questions that he would kind of by way of conversation ask is, so, how long have you been in the country? And who do you live with? Do you have your papers? And those who ended up being his victims were those who were undocumented.
Right.
And although he never said it in words directly, by his actions, that's what he was doing. He was targeting this very vulnerable population because the expectation was, what are you going to do?
Right.
You're not going to call the police because that's going to bring the police into your family's business.
Right.
So that's unfortunate that is the mentality of some individuals. But as you said earlier, and I didn't realize this until you said it, that's been going on for decades and decades. I thought that was maybe much more of a current evolution of the victimization. But it's interesting that the facts would actually bear that has been ongoing for a long period of time.
For sure. So, for example, there was a story done by Frontline a number of years ago, Rape in the Fields, about farm worker victims. And, what would happen is that the people who go sign up to be the foreman, in the, whether it's the meat processing factory in Iowa or whether it's the farm worker on a farm worker crew, where they know they're going to have undocumented women immigrants. You see the same thing with janitors in big cities, that there are sexual assault predators, that's the perfect job for them because they're looking for, as you talk about this individual, the example in Virginia, they're looking for targets that are going to be less likely to come forward and seek help. And so that's why, programs like this, for example, are really important because I cannot tell you how many of my clients at IUTA, I worked at a legal services agency years ago, working with Latina immigrants. It was their employers that told them. Their employers heard a public service announcement and said, there may be help for you. She may be the nanny who they know is being abused or they suspect might be abused by, their partner or something like that. So getting the word out into communities is really important about these remedies because victims don't call 911 and know that there's a U visa or a VAWA self-petition or, that they don't even know that if, for example, and I'm sure you see this in your criminal cases where, if somebody is forced to work in their perpetrator, their family, domestic violence case, they're forced to work in the family business and they're not paid, it's trafficking, potentially. And so you see, there's also domestic violence and sexual assault and all kinds of things going on, but you have all those kinds of things that are interrelated. And the goal was for people to come forward. I mean, the story that I think you alluded to that we talked about earlier this week that I think is important for people to understand is people think this is only domestic violence or it's only sexual assault, et cetera. But what is really important to understand is that these processes help immigrant victims who are living, as you were talking about, in the shadows, who are afraid or are being threatened because of their status, who are being abused because of their, because people think they can take advantage of them and they'll be silent. These programs help build relationships with law enforcement. So the case that we were talking about, there was a victim of domestic violence who was both abused by her gang boyfriend and forced to have sex with other gang members by her boyfriend, essentially raped by other gang members. And she made her way to local law enforcement and learned that as a victim of domestic violence, she could get a U visa. So the local law enforcement certified her case. She was in the process of getting the U visa. But as with many victims, until they get work authorization, until they get, till the Department of Homeland Security puts a stamp on their case and say, we believe you, we're going to protect you from deportation, she was still living with her perpetrator with the gang. And she heard them say, they were talking about two undercover police officers that they had identified they'd learned that these two gang members were undercover police officers and they put a hit out to kill them. And she picked up the phone and called the police officer she was working with in the department and told them, and they pulled the gang members out and said, they pulled not the gang members, they pulled the undercover police officers out, and it saved their lives. And if that domestic violence victim didn't have a relationship with the department because of the U visa program, those two officers could be dead today.
Yeah. And I think this goes all along the factor of trust. They have to trust the government. They have to trust, as part of that, law enforcement, the prosecutors, the judges, the system.
Right.
The story that you just gave to us, you indicated that you had actually learned that from one of the law enforcement officers. What was the setting that you came into contact with him?
So we have federal grants to do training for law enforcement. And so we travel around the country and we do training. So, the chief says, okay, that we would like this training, and they order everybody to show up. And so we were training a department outside of a big metropolitan area. And it was really interesting because we see this often, but not with this kind of a story necessarily, because they don't always tell the stories. But there was this big burly guy who my law enforcement, we always train with the law enforcement faculty, and the way my law enforcement faculty member describes it is like, this guy looks like he eats nails for breakfast. And it's exactly the guy you want to have as your backup on any kind of operation. He was like really tough. And he was, sitting in the back of the room, not saying much. It's like an 8-hour training, right? And towards the end of the day, we'd asked for examples of people, who had actually worked with the program. And the guy raised his hand and told this story about how important this program was. And for example, the U visa saved him and his partner's life. And that's how it came up. That's that their department had a policy, was using it actively, and they were seeing, he personally experienced the repercussions or the benefits of the fact that the program existed, and his department was using it effectively.
I'm going to segue a little bit away from the EU visas to within the immigrant community, violence against women.
Mm-hmm.
One, how is it documented? And two, do you think it is documented efficiently?
So we've done a lot of research on there have been a number of researchers that have done. So here's the issue. To do effective social science research, to kind of see what the trends are among immigrant victims, it's hard to do that kind of research. We think that the numbers, of the social science research that we've seen probably underreport what's happening, but there have been some pretty good social science studies over the years in different populations. And generally what they find is that in the domestic violence context, victims whose they experience a rate, immigrant victims, again, largely because of this dynamic, they can use this immigration-related threats as an additional tool to what everybody else experiences on top of it. And language access is a problem for a lot of victims. But that the rate of domestic violence among immigrant victims is probably, it's around 50%. It's quite high. And, high 40s, really low 50%, depending on the population, depending on the survey that was conducted. But what we found is among married women, immigrant women who are married to U.S. citizen husbands, that abuse rate jumps to almost 60%, which is almost 3 times the national average.
And is that the power difference between being documented and wow?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that immigrant women, victims of domestic violence, stay longer and experience higher levels of abuse than U.S. citizen-born women. And that's partially because the immigration-related abuse is a very powerful tool that locks victims in relationships. And if you add on top of that language access issues, so that they don't, what immigrant victims know about the United States and our justice system, it's not coming from television because they probably don't speak English. If they don't speak English, they're not getting it from like social media and whatever. They're getting it from their perpetrators. So he says, look, I'm a citizen and you're not. And if you try to get help or you try to leave, I'm going to get the kids. And she has no reason, and I'm going to get you deported and you're never going to see the kids again. Now, what's really exciting, we just published on Monday a piece of social science research that shows that those immigration-related threats, when a victim applies for a U visa or a VAWA self-petition, which is the domestic violence victim visa kind of thing, that by the time when they get work authorization and protection from deportation, there is a 74% drop in immigration-related abuse.
Wow.
There's a 78% drop in threats to cut them off from their children. And there's a 65% reduction in perpetrators trying to raise the victim's immigration status in criminal or family court proceedings. So that the programs, if we can let victims know about them and support them in applying, really do work to reduce the immigration-related abuse and to free victims to leave immigrant victims to leave abusive relationships and to be really successful, really resilient, that these forms of relief really help victims thrive. I mean, there's like a 300% increase in their ability to get, once they get work authorization protection from deportation, to get a job that pays at least a minimum wage, like a 542% increase in their ability to get a job where they get like healthcare benefits and maternity leave and sick leave. And they're 660% more likely, able to be involved in their kids' schools. So it's like, and then 226% increase in their enrolling in ESL classes. And, it just goes from there. It's like you see them thrive as they essentially get freed from these abusive relationships and employment situations that they've been locked in.
And those are amazing statistics, because I think that does help balance that power position between them and the other partner in their home. Because as you indicated, if you don't have the means to go outside the home, where are you going to get housing? You're not going to apply for public benefits. You're not going to apply for public assistance or even any sort of emergency services. And then when we talk about the benefit of the kids to have their parents involved with the school system, if you don't have that involved by a parent, that child is forced to navigate the school system on their own. Right. And not many kids are so equipped.
Right. Exactly.
So it's great to see that they then come out of the shadows into the light, but also more importantly, that they are supported by their community in being able really just to get basic opportunities.
Right.
Their success then becomes the community's success. So that really is what we, I think, have to keep talking about as to why this is not a means of bypassing the immigration laws, but really it's a means of ensuring the safety in our community. And that's the focus that we need to have within our community, because you mentioned this, where in criminal cases, the accused will at times use the fact that the victim has gone forward or has petitioned for a U visa as a means to establish bias for a false report. Mm-hmm. In our office, we started having this conversation. What we say is embrace the fact that they got the U visa, because they don't get it by just checking a box. There has to be an investigation. There has to be some serious background consideration. And then there has to be an endorsement. So that person is being screened. The fact that they made a report in of itself does not give them that path, so that you could yell and scream all you want if you're the accused and say this is why they're doing it. Because most of the time, there's also an extreme amount of evidence that shows what they accuse that person of is supported, not just by the words of the victim, but by other actions. So we embrace it. Let them scream and holler bias all day long, and then we'll take that. We'll disclose the fact if there has been a petition for a U visa, sure. And then let's go on to the facts of the case.
Exactly. And in fact, that is exactly the right approach. And in fact, there's some prosecutors, we work with a team of prosecutors nationally, and what we train prosecutors. There's actually another tool in the prosecutor's toolkit. So what you can do is, for example, the number of victims who pick up the phone and know what a U visa is when they call 911. It's not. They don't. So if you look at the timeline of a case, when the victim called the police for help, she was scared. She knew she was being abused and she sought help. And then she got to the prosecutor's office and, she talked to law enforcement, and law enforcement maybe referred her to a victim advocate. And then she learned from the victim advocate that there was a U visa. So there've been a lot of prosecutors who were able to, when the defense, they like actually lying in wait for the defense to raise the immigration issue so that they can bring in the victim's all her prior consistent statements and win the case. Because they have all the great evidence you're talking about, and then they rob the perpetrator by his own counsel's efforts. They make the case easier.
Right.
And so we've been very effective in training prosecutors to kind of get these prior and consistent statements in. And in some communities where they do that routinely, the defense counsel stop raising it because they lose more.
And that really what it is that sword of theirs ends up becoming the sword of the victim.
Right.
It's the truth. Bring it. You're exactly right. Because of your victimization, I had to seek this out.
Yeah.
Right. So those are amazing things that we can share with our community to be able to say that we support you to be able to come forward and make those claims of victimization or as a witness of seeing a crime being committed. Now, you indicated that you've been working with prosecutors' offices as far as trainings. Have you done any work with trying to open the lines of communication and maybe building bridges between prosecutors and law enforcement as to the importance of addressing immigration and victimization?
We try. We definitely do. We do a lot of trainings where, we'll get invited in, depending on the community, by the DA or by the law enforcement agency. And then we always encourage them to invite each other so that sometimes we're doing mostly a law enforcement training, but there's some district attorneys or prosecutors in the room. It's really important because sometimes the prosecution agency or the law enforcement agency, one of the two of them may know about these visas that can help crime victims, but the other doesn't. Right. And so we try to make sure that both of them know, because if not, you get these situations in some local communities where the prosecutors are afraid of the immigration issue coming up in the criminal case. And when they try to keep it out. The problem is they'll never really succeed. If they try to pretend like it's not going to come up or stick their head in the sand thinking you're going to ruin my case, it gets ruined anyway because the defense counsel isn't going to not bring it up.
Right.
And so we try to, train both and sometimes it's the prosecutors that take the lead. Like, for example, in Honolulu, the prosecutors do all the U visa certifications and T visa declarations and the local law, and they were trying to get their law enforcement to do them as well. And so we try to, bridge because it's a team, it's a partnership, and that it benefits everybody when both prosecutors and police do certifications, because there are cases, as you well know, that, the victim was really victimized, but your prosecution can't go forward because you haven't had a DNA hit on the rape evidence yet. So you don't know who the perpetrator is.
Right.
And you don't have to wait for that, because if the victim gets the U visa and starts in that process, and 5 years later somebody else comes forward and the DNA, you figure out who the person is, then you've got a stable victim who's already moved forward and is more likely to be able to cooperate once you get that hit.
No, that's awesome. So talk to me a little bit about the changes that they've just made recently as to the process. And I know you said earlier that the time has been decreased if it goes smoothly, from it being almost an average of 5 to a single year. But if you can, just share with us the process in of itself, because a lot of it was falling heavily on law enforcement. Now I think it also is, I don't want to say balanced, but somewhat complemented by the fact that it can also go through the prosecutors much more on a primary perspective.
Right. So what happens is for a victim to be able to file either a crime victim U visa case or a trafficking victim's T visa case, it's best, well, in the U visa case, they must get a certification from a government official. And those government officials could be a police officer, a prosecutor, a judge, the EEOC the EEOC, child welfare, adult protective services. Those are kind of the agencies that typically certify. And once the victim gets a certification and files the case, whether that certification comes from law enforcement or prosecution, it could be any of those. And we designed it that way because we knew, as you alluded to earlier, there may be communities where the prosecutor is aware of this, but the law enforcement isn't, or vice versa. And Congress wanted to give the victims the most number of doors to walk through in the system, because the goal was to begin to help bridge trust or build trust in the justice system writ large. And so the new procedures that went into place on Monday, what they do is once a victim files, so you get a certification, and the certification is like 3 or 4 pages. Most of the victims, this is where I like being on camera, most of the victims' case files when they file it are like this thick.
Wow.
And so it's, the victim's affidavit of the whole history of everything that happened to them. It could be medical records proving their injuries. It could be affidavits of witnesses. There's all kinds of evidence that gets presented in the full case to the Department of Homeland Security adjudicators. And so what happens is they file, they fill out a form, they put together all the evidence, including the certification, they file their case, and then DHS takes fingerprints, okay, so that everybody's background check is run. And so what has happened is you do all that, and then in the past, until Monday, the cases were just sitting there until they could get through the adjudication queue that is about 145,000 principal applications right now.
Wow.
And so, because Congress put a $10,000, not dollars, sorry, don't mean that. They put a 10,000 person per year cap on the number of U visas that could be awarded. And law enforcement and prosecutors and adult protective and child protective services and courts are finding these so helpful that there are more people coming forward than the 10,000 per year. So there's a backlog. And so what the Department of Homeland Security did on Monday is they said, let's screen these cases earlier, as soon as we can after somebody files, so that we can say, okay, let's screen them first in, first out basis, go look at them quickly. Is the evidence there? Did they submit enough evidence to prove their case? Does it look legitimate to us? And did they pass a background check? And once you do that, it gives the Department of Homeland Security the ability to say, okay, we're going to give work authorization and protection of deportation earlier to this victim, so that while they're waiting for their case to move through the process, they can be more engaged in the justice system, be more engaged in their communities, heal, seek help, and move on with their lives. So they're better witnesses in the criminal prosecution ultimately. In addition, it gives the Department of Homeland Security the ability to screen for the fraudulent cases early. So that when, other people are if somebody's trying to file a case, there's only an infinitesimally small percentage of all the cases filed that are like the last gasp for somebody who's a really bad actor. And they're saying, well, I was a crime victim, so I'll apply. But they'll be able to catch that small number of cases sooner and refer them for fraud investigations. Whereas if they wait 5 years, they're kind of hanging out in this backlog for 5 years and they're not getting identified either. And so you want this specialized team of adjudicators at the Department of Homeland Security that are trained in these crime victim cases like a good prosecutor would be or a good judge would be, to say, this is the legitimate cases. We're going to protect you while you're here. These are the people who cleared the background check. These are the cases that we think are legitimate, but we got to straighten out. There's a little more evidence needed for this, or maybe maybe she stole $15 of baby food as she was fleeing abuse in the middle of the night from a local 7-Eleven and got a 1-year suspended sentence for shoplifting. So you have something where the crime is totally related to victimization, But those cases are going to be more complex and they're going to take a little bit longer.
Right.
But in the meantime, the cases that aren't legitimate can get more easily identified sooner by the department. So it's a win-win for justice, the department, and for victims.
Now, do you have an idea as to where this is going to go within this current administration? As to, you mentioned there's 10,000, a cap of 10,000 applications that, not applications, I'm sorry, visas that get granted annually. Any conversation as far as increasing that number? Because if we already have, would you say, about 15-year backlog already?
Right.
We're not stopping the application, so it's not as if we're not going to accept any others, and we could take the next 15 years to clear them. Victims are going to continue to be victims.
Right. And they need to be able to continue to come forward, and which is why this new process will help them get some protection while they're waiting.
Right.
I think, there a lot of people have proposed, different administrations have proposed, law enforcement have proposed, prosecutors, victim advocates. I think a lot of people would be in favor of increasing the U visa cap or getting rid of it. The point is, when it was first developed, the trafficking victim had a 5,000 cap, and the Republicans that were working with us, bipartisan Republicans and Democrats, said, well, we think this is going to be a bigger category, so we'll make it a $10,000 cap. Back then, it seemed like a big number.
Right.
And the thought is if we needed more, you'd be able to come back to Congress and do it. But it would take bipartisan legislation in Congress to change the cap. And so a lot of people have proposed it. This is an area of the law that historically there has been strong bipartisan support for the VAWASO petition, the T visa, the U visa. Everything was bipartisan because everybody has an interest in fighting crime. There's nobody out there lobbying for the trafficker or the domestic violence perpetrator.
Right.
But, it has to find its way through Congress. And I think that's the challenge right now.
And I'm hopeful that conversation will be had, because we have to start reconsidering what immigration means and just the word immigrant means in our society, because it's been so blacklisted that it doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It almost feels like sometimes that the conversation doesn't include the why. Like, why is this important? It's like, oh my God, immigrant, we don't want to have any more of them coming into our country, because there's such a drain in our resources, and the fact that they're all criminals and on, all this negative labeling. But we have to get into that conversation and switch the lens into it not being about the immigrant, but being about the safety in the community that involves our immigrants.
Exactly.
And that I wonder, how do we help reconfigure that conversation so that we get that narrative to include the safety of our community?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really interesting. I think this survey that we just reported on really, I think, helps think about this, because it helps reframe it. Because one of the things that we learned from this group of, so if you look at immigrants generally, everybody has, there's language barriers, there's, they had their difficult role getting here, living under the shadows because of immigrant concerns about it. You have all of those things. And then you add to it this group of victims where they're victimized in this country, in addition to all that. And what was really amazing about what we learned from this study is that these victims, once they start getting help themselves, 22% of them reach out and help other survivors in their community, bring them to law enforcement, bring them to prosecutors, help them get help, and that they reconnect in there, become active in their communities. And so my thought is that the image that we have of given all of the barriers and all of the problems that immigrants have to overcome to thrive in this country, if you look at this group, they are really thriving by every measure, involvement in their kids' school, the amount of income they earn, their engagement in their communities. And if they can do that when they're, once they get work authorization and protection from deportation, if they can do that with a perpetrator in the United States out there, then imagine the benefits they bring to our community, that it's it's a different image than we have of immigrants, and I think it's a positive one.
That's excellent. So you indicated that victims themselves become ambassadors of safety and the U visas. How do we, as a system, how do we become the ambassadors to the community? Because you said, and you rightly identify the fact that because of the language barriers, we can't be on the news and they're listening to us. We may not be able to be in the newspaper and have an article set out for that. So we literally have to be in the community and conveying this information. How do we do that? Like, what is our source of conversation? With what groups do you think would be most impactful?
Well, I think there are two trains of thought on this. One is learning about who in your community immigrants trust. Who are the trusted people? And what's important to understand is that immigrants are a monolith. So who the men in the immigrant community trust may not be who the women in the immigrant community trust. And you want to reach both of those, right? So faith community, social services. So, immigrant crime victims, for example, they're always working with a victim advocate or an attorney. They don't find their way through the system by themselves. The advocacy programs, the community-based programs that serve immigrants are the brokers in a way that I think are important allies. But the other thing that, and that, I forgot what I was going to say about the other part, that you need these relationships. And the other part I wanted to say, and that we've seen in a lot of different social science research that we've done over the years, is that where a prosecutor's office or a police department or a court affirmatively has a program that says we're signing U visas or T visas, or we're issuing special immigrant juvenile status to abused children and abandoned and neglected children, that what we see is in those communities, we studied this in 2017 because we wanted to understand that as anti-immigrant sentiment goes up, do victims stop reporting? Is there more fear? And what we found was that yes, there generally is, except in communities where police departments, prosecutors, courts had actively been engaged in community policing with immigrant communities, developing relationships with immigrant communities, and we're using these programs. We're telling victims about these programs that reverberated. And in some, like in the courts cases where they were, let's say, doing protection orders, if you look at protection orders for immigrant victims, and courts that were doing special immigrant juvenile status and signing U visas saw increases of immigrants come to their courts despite anti-immigrant times. And so what we found is that those practices, these programs as tools, and using them to bridge relationships as tools to say, hey, we're doing this, we care about you, helps all immigrants come forward. It's not just the one victim. It reverberates because more relationships of trust get developed.
Yeah, no, because it's all about the community. Honestly, we all have to figure out how we can do our part with the role that we're playing to be able to message that.
Yeah.
Two more questions, but my second to last question for you is this. You indicated that you worked with IUTA for a while. Two-part question, because now as a lawyer, my two questions will be like 45. But two-part question is, one is, can you explain what IUTA is? Mm-hmm. And then as a segue to that, although our office the prosecutor's office or law enforcement may assist with the U visa, we don't fill out the U visa. We're not a source for the victim to use within the immigration process. So where would an immigrant go to be able to get those services?
Okay. So IUTA is a program, a community-based program that serves immigrants, a large proportion of whom are Latinos or Latinx community, but also other immigrants. I had clients from Ethiopia and Eritrea and Brazil and Cuba and all kinds of places, but also all over the world. I had I think some Vietnamese clients, et cetera. And so it's a legal services agency that serves the immigrant community. And there are legal services and victim services agencies that specialize in serving immigrant victims. So, for example, the Tahiri Justice Center in Virginia is an example of a program. Many of them are nonprofit. They're all nonprofits. Some of them are funded, are more legal services than social services agencies. Some of them are social services agencies. It really varies by the community. We have a directory that we've developed on our federal funding that helps track. We've identified all of the programs in every state that we've been able to identify that have real experience working with immigrant survivors. So if you go to our website, I think it's directory.niwap.org is what I think it is. And if you go to if you type NIWAP library, you'll get our library, and there's a tab at the top that says directory, and it leads you to our directory, and you can put in your state and you can see who we've been able to identify. And it ranges from, a small program in a more rural area where there's a Latina advocate, that has training, to a whole agency that is focusing on immigrants. It's very broad, but it's all people who have real life experience in communities serving immigrant crime victims and immigrant kids.
Very cool. Now, my last question. You've been doing this for 3+ decades. Yet again, a two-part question. One, why did you get into it and how? And then secondarily is what keeps you still in it? Because this also has got to at sometimes just be emotionally draining and dispiriting.
So I got into it because it's one of those kind of crazy stories. I was looking for a public interest job after law school, and I sent out a bunch of this. You and I might remember this. For me, it was way before the internet. So finding public interest jobs was really hard, and I got a letter from a judge who had a friend who was a public interest lawyer who got my resume, who said, "Do you want to come clerk for me?" And that was Gladys Kessler when she ran the family division of the DC Superior Court. And during the time that she was starting up the protection order court in DC. So as her law clerk, I learned early protection order law from that experience. And then my next job was, they said, do whatever you want, serve whoever you want, just speak Spanish. Somebody got a job from, a grant from Marion Barry's administration to work with the Latino community. And why they hired the green guy, I never will understand. But the point was, I asked people and I said, well, who's doing the domestic violence case? And they basically said, nobody. So there was a local Latina social worker from Chile who started sending me her clients. And there was one DC police officer who spoke Spanish from El Salvador, and we started doing all the cases. And so that's how I started. And one thing led to the next. And, in those days, it was holistic legal services, right? You couldn't just do the protection order, you had the divorce and custody and child support. And there wasn't immigration relief back then, but immigration, I did petitions, licenses, whatever, because that was it.
Right.
And the advantage, and that leads me to the second part of your question, is I have had the privilege, because of that, starting at that place in time where there were no boundaries. You couldn't say, I'm only doing the immigration case or I'm only the family lawyer. You had to kind of be the jack of all trades, which gave me the opportunity to see how they all connect. So there's things that we learned from family law that have been very helpful in the immigration negotiations and the immigration law. There are, I see connections and opportunities among these fields all the time. And that's what excites me. I see we can figure out a way to solve that problem. And it's never boring. It's never, the same, because each case is different. Yes. And the challenge is, as more and more people do this work, they run into interesting questions and barriers. And one of the things I get to do in my job at the university doing national technical assistance is we can see patterns. And people call us with questions and problems, and what somebody might have solved in one community, we can connect somebody in another community that's having the same problem. And then we can create a tool nationally that helps other people do. And so it's always exciting.
That is awesome. I love the energy and the positivity of that. Because I tell everybody this, I'm a law geek. I love the law. I love how we can use the law to solve problems.
Yeah.
And the best thing that we could do is to have a holistic approach to the problem. You know, it's the law is really no different than healthcare. I can't have you come in because you're sneezing and only deal with the sneeze, right? What's causing it? Like what ultimately has given that symptom its place and time? Right. So those are things that I really like, and I appreciate the time that you've given us here today and the information. I am going to hijack that directory link, and I'm going to go ahead and put that on our page in our chat, because I would love for the community to be able to know what the resources. In times of crisis, that's not the time to search for resources. There's too much trauma going on in the moment that it's better to be able to have it as a resource that's available to you. Well, very, very much appreciate it. So Dr. Orloff, I really do, as I said earlier, I appreciate your time and your information. And I'm going to ask for a favor. And my favor would be is, what message would you give to our immigrant community right now, those who are in a position that they're being victimized, as to what they can do to maybe assist themselves out of that situation?
I would say, to know that there is immigration protection available, and that the threats that the perpetrator may be making are not true. That courts, your local police, your local prosecutors, you can go Google your local shelter and call them for help. They will have language lines that can help you communicate. And, seek help. And there is help available. There's a whole world of us out here that are trying to help make everyone's life savers, and the victim's life, your life as a victim as well. So there is help available, and that things can change. And we've spent years creating laws to help you leave your abuser, leave your abusive workplace, get legal work authorization, care for your children, and move on with your life, and hold the perpetrator accountable so that he doesn't harm others.
Amen.
Thank you.
To our viewers, thank you very much for joining us here today on Get the Tea with Buta. Until next week, we wish you the best of luck and have a great week. Thank you.